climate change from different sort of angles and different perspectives and from our different backgrounds. And so a hui of us got together in 2019 and we presented at the Hawaii Conservation Conference. And we talked about Kane and Kanaloa, so our different akua. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that today. And this is our way of engaging in climate change discussions. And I've been lucky to have been a part of many Indigenous climate change conversations with our friends in Alaska and our friends on Turtle Island on the continent and across this Pai'aina as well. And it's something that I really enjoy doing and having these conversations. So I'll take you on a little journey here. So our climate collective, when we first started talking to each other and realized we were doing similar things, we wondered what did we do that was a little different. First of all, you might have noticed in the previous slide that we're all wahine, we're all females. And so there's a lot of females working in climate change. A lot of the conversations and the conferences I go to, it's wahine dominated, it's female dominated. And it makes sense. And so we talked about how we as wahine are the ones who take care of our communities and we take care of our children. And that's what really brings us to this space. And so part of that helps us reframe the narratives of climate change. And I'm going to talk to you about how I think of climate change and how the dialogues that I do around it are framed through my Indigenous perspective, but also my perspective as a mother and ana wahine. And so this helps us to strengthen our communities, right? Our goals as wahine working in climate change are to promote environmental resilience, to work with our communities, and to be the ones to engage in these discussions. And so I love being here with you today and helping all of us to recognize, acknowledge, kilo, and just be a part of these conversations. Again, so I'm not the only one, Kavika's not the only one, we're just one of many faces that are joining you that are ready to have these dialogues and conversations with you. So I'm going to structure my talk a little bit about how can we connect to climate change through three different sort of avenues. One is through the idea of akua, and then we'll talk a little bit about some mo'olelo, and then I'll finish with sort of how I reframe climate change through the lens of pilina, through connections and relationships. Many of you might have heard the word akua. You might know some of our akua out in the environment, but I'm also going to challenge you to think of akua a little deeper, as akua being the embodiment of natural forces, these environmental energies that surround us. When the word akua, when these ideas were translated into the English dictionary, it's really hard to understand someone else's spiritual and religious worldview, understanding how these processes in the environment are shared across different worldviews, right? And so as I've been a student of the Kanakaole family for many years, I've danced hula with them since I was a child. And I've also been a student with them now through their Papakumaka Valu trainings. And through all of these processes, we try to help, and they try to help us understand our akua in a deeper sense as what these supernatural beings are and how do we share the processes they are and how we interact with them. And so on the screen, I have pictures of akua, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about some of the akua that I want to introduce to you today. Here we go. So I just pulled some little quick emojis off the internet today. But most of you guys know of our major akua, Kane, Ku, Lono, and Kanaloa. And what you might know about them is sort of their human personifications or how they're talked about in stories as people. And that's the way you connect with them, right? If you talk to your students about something that's super abstract, it's hard for them to connect to those ideas. But if you make them personal, right, that's an easier way to relate to them. So in all our stories about Kane and Kanaloa, you can read deeper into the stories where they're talking about different environmental energies, different processes that are happening at the same time. And these are easily demonstrated usually by the stories of Pele, right? So everyone in Hawaii knows about Pele. We know she represents the fire and the lava and the volcano. She's present in all the seascapes around me. In my background here, you see the Pele entering the ocean, the Kanaloa. But if we look deeper at what Pele means, Pele represents the entire lava cycle. She represents heat that comes from within the earth. In the stories, her father is the heat that comes, Kane Makua, the heat that comes from above. So Pele is the female heat that comes from within the earth. Just like us females have heat within us, right? That help us give birth. So we know about Mahina, the goddess Hina, and her moon cycles, right? And how she helps regulate the tides. It's not a person doing that. It's the energies that exude from the moon, from Hina itself, from the Mahina, pulls water around the earth, creating those different tidal cycles. So those are all the influences that the moon has on others. And that's we call Hina, because she is Mahina, she is the moon. And so these different energies, we can think of Kane, he's represented a lot by the sun in the sky, but really Kane is the heat. And heat on our earth from the sun creates rain. So we know him as fresh water as well, right? And his partner is Kanaloa. And so Kanaloa, we think of as the ocean. But Kanaloa is more than the ocean. He's any contained water body. So the water within yourself, right? It's salty, just like the ocean. So that's Kanaloa water. The water that's underneath our island, trapped in our aquifers, which we are pulling from, especially on Oahu, where you pull from your aquifers to feed your people, and as we're contaminating it as well, right? Those are all contained water bodies. And then we have Ku and Lono. We think of Ku as a war god, but Ku is that very male vertical energy rising. Lono is sound. It's what you hear. It's that wind. And so he has a different energy. And so if we think about them as the environmental processes out in the environment, and not just as man, or not just as fictional stories, we see that Kane and the heat from the sun is what creates the clouds and what brings rain to our islands, right? He brings the fresh water. The sun brings that. That's an environmental process that we teach our students about. And so the formation of clouds, because the sun heats the ocean and the ocean has evaporation, that whole trade wind cycle that brings most of our rain to Hawaii is that Kane cycle. The Ku cycle is that earth energy, that vertical energy. So he is a lot associated with the forest, right? And we know as part of the water cycle, we need our forest to bring the water from the clouds down onto our earth. So that vertical exchange of water, the presence of our forests around our islands and of our trees, our koas and our koas and our ohias, they bring that water. So Ku isn't heat, right? Kane is the heat, but Ku is change. That's why he's associated with a lot of wartime things, right? All those kind of change in time and place, but all that energy movement is really important for our water cycle. Lono, we talked about Lono is what you hear. You think of Lono a lot of times as the agricultural god, and that's because Lono has a different water cycle than Kane does. And Lono, you hear the rain, you hear those storms. So Lono water is very heavy, descending rain. So you put all these different characteristics of our akua together with how they're represented on the landscape. And so being able to hear the rain coming, that's our Lono rains. And so Lono represents year-round weather. He represents storms that come throughout, right? So Kane is going to be our normal trade weather, but all these storms, all these patterns that you hear, those are going to be represented by Lono. Our Laka weather systems. Now, Laka, we can maybe think of as our hula goddess, right? Our deity that we represent by bringing the kuahu, the forest, to our hula. And Laka is that female water energy. And females, almost all of the akuas, the gods, the deities, these environmental processes that are female in nature are usually going to be cyclic, right? So Laka is our cycles of water. It's our horizontal water. It's this cycling, this evapotranspiration, this light kind of mist. Those are our Laka water processes. So as you can see, I kind of walked you really quickly through different akuas that we talk about all the time, but then I've connected it now to how they are represented in the environment and how we can connect to each of these akuas and understand these environmental process more personally, right? So I've kind of paired up our different akuas here. I changed them up a little bit. So we have Kane and Kanaloa. And Kane cannot happen without Kanaloa, right? The sun has to heat the ocean has to evaporate from that heat, and it brings the fresh water. So that's why Kane and Kanaloa are always paired. They're always together. But Kane has to do with anything with the earth and the sun, and Kanaloa has to do with anything on the ocean. Then we know about our ku and hina processes. So ku we think of as a male process, hina as a female process, but ku is just that vertical energy rising, and my hina is more of our horizontal energy flows, the tidal actions that happen, things that have to do with the moon, birth and growth cycles. And as I said before, our wahine cycles, our haumeas, our hi'iakas, they're all going to be that. All these akuas that we talk about, all these different fun people that have stories around them are actually represented in our landscapes. And then again, we have our lono and our laka. So our lono is our heavy, loud, descending energy, and laka is our light, misty cycling of water. So when you start connecting with our akuas in this way, you start becoming more personable with the environment around you. And that's what I want to kind of have as our narrative when we talk about climate change. It's not something that happens out there. It's not something that's objective that's happening. These energies are always constant, and we can be a part of these cycles. We can recognize them. We can name them. And that's what our kupuna did. That's how we had 40,000, 400,000 akuas, because they named every separate environmental process that happens. That's why there's hundreds of kus and hundreds of kanes, because Kane Hunamoku is different than Kane Hualani. They had a different environmental process that they were explaining. So I find this super exciting, and it's a great way for my students to kind of look more into Hawaiian akuas and into their stories, and then look out in the environment and make those connections and see how well our kupuna understood the environment around us and what changes that happens. And so when we talk about climate change, we say we want to connect people to our environment through stories. Okay, so let's go really quickly through our mo'olelo. I love to talk story. I like to look at old stories like Ehuiki Manoa Pu'uloa. I talked to you about Kane and Kanaloa. There's so much environmental processes that we can pull out of these stories if we just take the time to read it with a different lens. But I also like to talk stories with those kupuna around us and look at ocean currents. So these are some of the Kane that I've talked with. I'm going to flip through this really quick because I know I'm running out of time. But I wanted to mention some of the work that I did with surfers. And this is also another great way to connect to your students is what are those processes they do out on the landscape in the ocean? Do they surf? Do they paddle? And then have them use those interactions with the ocean to understand the processes that are important. So I asked surfers, what makes good surf? And I showed them different graphs. And this is a great way for them to connect with it. And so here you'll see, this is called a wave rose. It's just telling you what direction the waves come when they hit hilo, how strong they are, and how often they come. And then this is a map of how often they come. And I asked them, how is a surf when it comes from these different directions? So when it comes from the A direction, they don't like that surf. But we're getting more of it through climate change. When it comes from the C direction, that's their ultimate goal. That is normally the trade wind direction, but we've had less trade winds in years. So I connect what they experience with the data that we're about. And so I'll show you some of that here now. I presented with them all these different scenarios, and I'll flip through them here really quickly. Stream flow and rainfall data. It's very important here in Hilo for all our river mounts to create the surf that we're used to. But we've seen a decline in the 30 years. This map is showing us wind and wave heights. And again, we can see this downward trend that we've been having less trade winds, less big waves, which doesn't make surf then. And again, I showed you the wave direction. So this bottom one is an average of all the 2009 to 2013 surf compared to 2012. And you can see how we have a shift in directions and frequency in the surf direction. And I also presented our surfers with the data that sea level has been rising here in Hilo, Hawaii for 100 years. We've had a foot of sea level rise over the last 100 years. mostly because Hawaii Island is subsiding. But you can see also that it's not a straight line, that there's lots of movement in our sea level rise. And so it helps people understand this is the data for my location in Hilo. Maui's is going to be different. Kauai's is going to be different. North Shore will be different. So it's fun to get the data from your specific place and have them relate to that. So when I ask people how the surf was, they tell me that surf was better in the past. But they also tell me there's been no real change. And they always tell me they're going to keep surfing, right? So this is sort of the narrative that I've taken away from climate change is that, you know, when we stop and reflect and we get people who are connected to places for long times, like our surfers. I interviewed many 50, 60, 70-year-old surfers who've been surfing the same spot for decades. And they can tell things have changed, but they also understand change as being constant. Change being huge events might be more detrimental to what we want to do. But as those conditions change, as you see in the top one, people change as well. And you're not the same surfer at 70 as you were when you're 20, when you're 30. And you as a surfer changed along with the surf at your surf site. So as long as you're connected to the places that you're observing, then you can change along with it. And you accept that change, you're part of that change. And then it'll always be fun to continue surfing. So I'm going to finish up a little bit about that relationship. And I really started to understand how important your relationship was to how you interact with your environment when I worked with a colleague in France. And this colleague in France was doing the same thing that I was doing here in Hawaii. We were interviewing ocean goers, we were interviewing our kupuna. She was interviewing sailors who sail across the Atlantic. I was interviewing surfers and lifeguards here in Hawaii. They're very different kind of places, but we asked them some similar questions. So one of those questions that we asked was, where does the ocean begin? And as you can see here in Hawaii, the people I interviewed said, well, the ocean, it's right there on the shoreline. It's where you put your feet in. It's the tide pool. It's the water inside of me, right? Our Kanaloa waters, everything in the ocean is a part of us here in the islands. There's no stop. We understand the ocean goes through our island, right? Our aquifer, our freshwater aquifer sits on salt water. The ocean is all around us. Yet in Europe, their perspective of the ocean was different. They see the coastal seascape separate from the ocean. Many of the responses, not all, said ocean begins where you can't see land. They gave us political definitions of 200 nautical miles out, where it's the open ocean, that's where it begins. And to me, that really tells you about how we're related to the environment around us. And because we in Hawaii are connected to this place, we're going to have a different association with how it changes through time and how we interact with it. And so I encourage you to take your students. These are pictures of me with different students, with my kids, right? Just interacting with nature and creating that palina with our akua. So when I take them into Kanaloa and I talk to them about his processes, it's not this abstract ocean with numbers and digits. You know, they have a personal connection to the data they're collecting, to the areas they're in. And just as we change as we grow older, just as we interact with those around us and we care for those that are closest to us, that's the same way we'll care for those around us and care for these places. So to think of climate change as something personable, as something that we're all a part of, and to connect to these environments, because only if you love a place will you really work to save it and to protect it and understand what's going on around it. So thanks for sharing my story, and I'm not sure if I left any time for questions. If not, I'm always around after. Mahalo. That's a good question about the curriculum. I have a current grant through NOAA. It's called Precipitating Change, and we're talking a little bit about these akua processes. It's going to be focused on intermediate school students learning about coastal erosion, but I don't know of any specific curriculum that's been developed yet. I can provide some kind of PowerPoints and stuff if you're interested, and there's some great webinars that have been going through the Gladys Brandt webinar series, and I can send those links to Kanoi to post. So Auntie Pua Kanakaole has some great TEDx talks and some great webinar talks where she talks about this in detail. So yeah, I can send those along.
You know, can we ask one more question? Can we slide one more in?
Yeah, we can do one more.
Aloha Noa Lani, and thanks everyone for sliding us in. As I was watching, I don't know if anyone else is having this reaction, but I was like having a profound moment because I've always envisioned Eke Akua like Eke Akua like very spiritual, godly, and so I've been as a DOE teacher, I'm a little uncomfortable venturing into that space, and yet I can't deny that I feel it deep down in my na'au, like these energies that you speak of. So I guess I'm just if you can give us any advice in navigating that spiritual space from a state kind of, but I see so much value to making that connection of the energy in a more spiritual sense, not religious sense. So if you have any advice for us as we kind of navigate that space.
Thank you. That's a great and hard question. I do this activity with my students where we look in the dictionary as what does akua mean? And you break it up into all the different dictionaries. And so one definition is keakua, God. But that, right, was a new sort of translation, and that is still an accepted translation, keakua. If you look deeper into the dictionary, you can see akua means supernatural beings. It talks about processes that humans don't have control over. So they called a watch in ancient Hawaii an akua process because the watch did its thing. It ticked its, hands and fingers, whatever those things are around the world by itself, right? And humans didn't have control over that. That wasn't a human process. It was an akua process. And so people can relate to it as spiritually as you want to, but I try to take, like you said, sort of the religion out of it and just talk about what does supernatural mean? What is natural and what is supernatural? And having those conversations and never giving definitions, but allowing each person to connect to those in their own ways and just understanding that these processes happened above and beyond us, right? And then I also help them look at just the word kua and the word ah. And ah means to spark something, and kua is the backbone of our world. So yeah, just exploring definitions usually helps me. And I don't, again, try to do anything that's religious. I don't think we need to go there, but the spiritual part is cool. And just understanding natural world around us and having a palina to that, a relation to that is important. So you can do that spiritually, you can do that through religion, or you can just do that through the just amazing awe and wonder that happens when you watch that beautiful rain or that beautiful rainbow or that storm that comes through. Yeah. So thank you. I'll turn it over to Kavika now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I should be able to share screen. Okay, so okay, can you guys see that okay? Yes.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, that was an amazing presentation. I thank you so much. I'm gonna be taking a slightly different angle, but a very similar angle in the sense that I'm gonna be talking about different knowledge systems. And so Noi was sharing about the knowledge system that she learned through her hula line, and I'll be sharing some of the knowledge that I've learned through my hula line. So these are, in the when in the old days when you were trying to learn something, they would always say nana iki kumu. So look to the source of that knowledge. And so these are some of the kumu that I've had in my life. These many amazing kupuna who have now passed on, but I'm going to be focusing in on the mo'olelo. One of the mo'olelo of my kumuhula, John Kaimikawa, who was at the time of his life, was the last keeper of a priestly line of knowledge that dated back to ancient Molokai to the 9th century. So part of the mo'olelo is about the genesis of the ahupua'a system and things like that. So according to and this is the pre-ali'i era in Hawaii. So talking about different knowledge systems, we have knowledge systems that descend from the ali'i era. We have knowledge systems that descend from the kingdom era, and we have knowledge systems that predate those, predate the arrival of the ali'i when there were already a lot of people here. So this is a story from that time. So before the ali'i came, when the islands were populated, before the islands were populated, there was abundant resources, right? And then people show up, and then over time, you're going to have a decline in resources. And so they gathered together these councils of elders, and it was decided that they should divide the islands into moku. And so these moku were divided, and there was an AHA council for every moku. So these councils made decisions about resources and resource management and how to maintain the island and its integrity and provide for the needs of the people. And under this system, people thrive. But over time, and if there was ever trouble in one particular moku, then that moku, AHA Moku Council would get together and make decisions to set things right such that there could be abundance again. If there's ever a time when the whole island became there were challenges the whole island faces, then the whole island council would get together and they would make decisions by that. But through the system, the people thrived and the population increased, and there was sustainable resource management and things like that. But there became a time eventually when the whole island's resources were strained, and so the councils got together and decided that they needed to divide the islands further into ahupua'a. And so within each ahupua'a, there was a council that managed the resources of the ahupua'a, or made decisions for resource management in the ahupua'a. And if there was ever a time when the resources of a single ahupua'a were strained, that's the time when the councils would get together and make decisions and bring things right again. If there's a occasion where multiple ahupua'a and a single moku were having challenges, then that would be a time where the moku level councils would be called together to bring things back to pono. If there's ever a time when multiple ahupua'a and multiple moku were having challenges, that would be a time that the whole islands council would be called together to bring back pono on the land and restore the abundance and the balance and things like that. So this is called the aha kiole. I'm sorry. So it's a 3-leveled system. Councils for the ahupua'a level, for the level, and the mokupuni level. These are called aha kiole. Aha coming from the Hawaiian word for rope, which is also basically acknowledging the synergy of multiple perspectives coming together to create something that's stronger than the individual parts. And kiole was a ancient word on Molokai that referred to all of the pua, the baby fish that would come in and shroud the coastline with millions of baby fish. And these were called aha kiole because the decisions they made enabled the population of the kanaka on the land to become as abundant as the kiole in the ocean. And so these aha councils were made up of the wisest of the practitioners. You'd pick the one who knew the most about the fishing, the one who knew the most about the forest, the one who knew the most about So there were 8 realms of resource management that the councils made their decisions by. I'll go through these one by one. So the first one is Moana Akea, and I was thinking back to what Noi was saying about where does the ocean begin. So from this line of teachings, the ocean begins at the shoreline and extends all the way out to the horizon, as is seen from the highest point in your moku. And the next one is a Kahakai Pepeao, which is the shoreline areas between the high water mark and where the soil begins. And then you have the areas that have the soil all the way to the top of the mountain. And then you have the sources of fresh water. You have the processes in the heaven, the rainbows, the clouds, the rains, and things like that. And then you have the people. This is the good of the people. What's important about this is all of those other realms were managed for their own integrity, not for the needs of the people. The needs of the people were a whole different realm of management. And then you had indigenous knowledge systems, the maintenance of different lines of knowledge of medicine, of astronomy, astrology, healing, construction, canoe carving, and things like that. And then you had all of the things needed to maintain the pono on the land, your ceremonies, your prayers, and things like that. So these were the 8 realms of resource management that guided the pre-Ali'i times in Hawaii. So just as an example, so let's say there was an issue in a particular area, and so the AHA councils were gathered, and going through a process to come up with ideas for solutions. If you ever had a situation where any of these 8 realms was negatively impacted, that decision would not be implemented. So they would keep thinking things through and discussing it until they got to a point where a solution was good by all the realms, and then it was approved for implementation. So when these things were implemented, they're always done in a way that honored those that have gone before, but done to address the needs of the current generations and also to set a foundation for a more abundant future for the unborn generations. So these were the ahakiole that were maintained through the histories of the island of Molokai that have been passed down to me. And so I'm going to share a little bit of applications of how we're addressing or we're applying these concepts in the contemporary era in the restoration that we're doing, the biocultural restoration, ahupa'a scale restoration. So in my previous job on Kauai, I was director of this botanic garden and nature preserve. And up in the top in the Wa'okua, we had populations of these endangered seabirds. And so, one of the main predators of these seabirds is rats. And so the seabird conservationists, none of who are from Hawaii, but they all, love seabirds and are dedicated their lives to preventing these birds from going extinct. They've identified rats as a problem. So one of them came up with a solution of, we'll just do aerial drops of rodenticide, like literally tons of aerial of rodenticide would be airdropped into our Wawakua. And they all thought this was an amazing idea. And I told them, no, we're not doing that, because I was in charge of what happened in the valley. And everybody's getting really frustrated with me. At one point, one of the seabird conservationists pulled me on the side. He said, why are you giving us such a hard time about this? And I was just so shocked at his question. So I shared with him the stories that I shared with you about how I was taught how to make decisions. And, okay, here's a problem. Seabirds are going extinct because the rats keep predating on them and eating their chicks and their eggs and things like that. Okay, so here's a solution. Let's drop tons of rodenticide from a helicopter into our sacred forest. Okay, would that be good by the Mauka areas? Would that be good by the streams? Would that be good by the people? Would that be good by the ocean? And I told him, unless I'm confident that that decision is not going to have any negative impacts to any of those other realms, I'm not going to okay it. And so once I explained it like that, he understood. And then just another contemporary example. So I'm currently the director of the National Estuarine Research Reserve in He'eia. This is a picture of the ahupa'a, and I don't know if you can see my cursor, but right there is a island called Mokuolo'e. He'eia is one of those unusual ahupa'a that the boundaries go across the ocean and connect to another piece of land, and it includes this island Mokuolo'e. We're actually in the process of developing a Malama'aina plan for Mokuolo'e, the island. This is where I'm based. And so we are applying these ancient concepts in how we're thinking about the Malama'aina plan, but we're looking at it through a contemporary lens. So there's this area, Kalevalani, we're thinking that is the atmosphere, right? So one of the issues with climate change is there are changes in our atmosphere, increased carbon. So we're thinking of this as the carbon sequestration part of the plan. So anyway, just another example of how we're applying these different lines of knowledge into addressing climate change that we're dealing with now. So I might have, that's the last slide, and I might have some time for some questions.
Hi, Dr. Winter. I don't know if you can see me, but just wanted you to spend out, if you could, if you could talk a little bit more about the 3 decision strategy that you use and how we might maybe teach that with our students, or how do we frame that for them? I'm sorry, I was trying to formulate a better question, but
No.
this is going so quick and you gave us so much. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. And
yeah, sure. Happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think in general, especially under the influence of contemporary American culture, which is very individualistic, and it's driven by notions of capitalism that influence the way our families and our communities think about how they are being in the world. things weren't like that in the old days. It was about the collective, like Noi pulled together her climate collective, right? So we are trying to, I think when I engage in students, I'm always trying to get them to think more from the collective mindset. And so if you take a moment to ask, okay, be very thoughtful in your actions. Like, yeah, you have to be thoughtful in your decisions, but then you have to be thoughtful in your actions and how you implement those decisions. So before you do one thing, are you doing it in a way that honors your kupuna? Are you doing it in a way that's good for you, which is ultimately usually the driving motivation? But also, are you doing it in a way that makes things better in the future? Or are you just amassing wealth for yourself and you're not even thinking about how it impacts the future generations, which is a big reason why we're dealing with climate change right now, is because there have been multiple generations of the most powerful nations making decisions about amassing wealth for themselves. So I'm not sure if that answers your question adequately, but that's generally how I try to approach it with the students and my own kids, actually. Mahalo for your question.
Thank you, guys.
Mahalo, Kavika. Patty, do you have a question, or Justin? Maybe Justin go next, and then Patty.
Yeah, go for it, Layla. One sec, she's coming up.
Hi, I'm Patty. No. Aloha. Thank you guys so much for all your knowledge, sharing all your knowledge. I was just wondering, with the Kauai, when you did your work on Kauai, if you guys got everyone together and did come up with solutions besides throwing tons of rat poison into the abattoir. But yeah, thank you guys.
Yeah, yes, good question. We did, and we decided to go with a manual trapping program that was more labor intensive and a little bit more expensive, but really that's the only option that we could do, because I've seen the Limhuli stream where it comes out. I don't know if you know Haena, but where that stream meets the road is a place the community calls Cold Pond. And I've seen mothers take their newborn babies into that water because they perceive it as some of the most pristine waters in the area. And so it just wasn't even, I would not entertain anything that would jeopardize that. And so I just held firm, and we came up with another way to do the program, and the monitoring we've done has showed it's been very effective. So we're really happy about that. Thank you.
Mahalo nui, Dr. Minter. For all of your mana'o, just wondering if you could go back to the 8 realms of the Ahakiole and just share a little bit more about that, because you just went through it so fast and it was such good mana'o. Mahalo nui.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I was rushing through that. I'm not sure what specifically I could go into more. Do you want me to go over them again? I think, well, the thing I'll say is, I think it's easy for us to be very anthropocentric in our thinking, right? And thinking it's all about us and we got to manage for us. But as you saw with Noi's presentation too, this is very much about making sure the processes that created our islands continue, because that is what sustains us, right? So her talk was all about maintaining the akua processes. And what I shared is that in ancient Molokai, at least, decisions were made by not what was good for the people. The people was just one realm, but it was the good of the islands. What's the good? How do we do right by the islands? How do we do right by the ocean? How do we do right by the waters? How do we do right by the heavens? And then how do we do right by us in all this context? But a part of that is also maintaining the knowledge systems, right? That's a whole nother realm. Indigenous knowledge systems. There's not only one way to maintain knowledge. There's not only one line of knowledge. There's the old Hawaiian saying, not all knowledge is kept in one school. So you need to maintain all of those schools to maintain a healthy civilization. And then the last realm being ke'ihi'i, like acknowledging that there is spirit in things, and pono is a state of being where everything is in harmony and balance. And you need these ceremonies and these prayers and these practices to maintain that spiritual balance in the landscape and through ourselves and our relationship with place. And so when things fell out of pono, that's when, you know, the aha councils would get together and try to figure out what's going on, and then they would come up with solutions to help get restore the pono in the land. So I know it's a lot of teachings in a very short amount of time, but I really should probably pass it on. But thank you for the opportunity to share.